my dear friend and great colleague, the wonderful, excellent, and superb Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. And thank you all for coming. Now, if President Trump's State of the Union was a manifesto of mistruths, as Speaker Pelosi so aptly put it, President Trump's latest budget proposal is a blueprint for destroying America. One word, 9 letters, sums up the president's budget. HYP, OCRISY, hypocrisy. In his State of the Union address, President Trump talked at length about health care, claiming amazingly at one point he will fight to protect patients with pre-existing conditions. We know the president just lies about protecting health care, and his budget is proof. In the State of the Union, if the State of the Union is what he says, the budget is what he does, and the two are from different planets. I like to say the budget is the truth serum, and now the American people can clearly see that he is a fraud who is not fighting for them. Under Donald Trump, the average American is struggling to keep up, and his budget would make life harder for them. President Trump likes to talk about the forgotten man and woman. Well, in this budget, he's forgotten about the very people he promised to help in his State of the Union last week. So let me go over a few of the areas. On health care, the president said he'd never cut Medicare and Medicaid. He slashes both. $1 trillion in cuts to Medicaid in the Affordable Care Act. Hundreds of billions of cuts in Medicare. And the president even proposes a $35 million cut to CDC's Infectious Disease Rapid Response Reserve Fund. This is the fund currently being used to respond to the coronavirus outbreak. On education, the president's budget would devastate our nation's students, both K through 12 and college. His budget cuts the Strengthening Institutions program that assists historically black colleges and universities and other minority-serving institutions. Typical hypocrisy. At the State of the Union, he was bragging how he helps HBCUs. His budget cuts them. It cuts after-school and summer learning programs for 2 million young people. Rural education grants will hurt 18,000 school districts across the country. In the president's budget, hundreds of billions of dollars would be slashed from student loan forgiveness. He actually makes it harder for kids to pay back their debt. Instead of a limit of 10% of income per year, it goes up to 12.5% under his budget. That's how he cares about students and the overwhelming burden of debt they have. He slashes federal housing assistance. He slashes federal disability insurance. So if you're an American struggling with student loan debt or health problems or housing costs or hunger, the president's budget says you're out of luck. Meanwhile, if you're a millionaire, billionaire, a corporation, a big oil wildcatter, the president's budget says you're in luck. You're in clover. And lastly, the president's budget doesn't make it harder to fight climate change alone. It would exacerbate, make worse the climate crisis, not just not fight it, but make it worse. He cuts EPA funding by more than 25%. He cuts renewable energy funding, clean energy like wind and solar, 75%, and cuts funding for climate research, gashouse green monitoring, and emissions reduction activities in this anti-science administration that he leads. President Trump's budget even cuts disaster relief for FEMA by $12.2 billion. And so much of the disaster is caused by climate. The Earth's on fire. Antarctica had a 64-degree record temperature this week. And what is the president's response? He douses the fire with lighter fluid, of weakened pollution regulations, and then proposes cutting the fire department. We know how much he cares about the oil companies, but his budget makes clear he doesn't give a hoot about the future of this globe and is fine leaving to our children and grandchildren a globe in much worse shape even than it is today. Speaker Pelosi.
Thank you very much, Leader Schumer, for your leadership in fighting this budget. The budget, our federal budget, should be a statement of our national values. What is important to us as a nation should be reflected in how we allocate our resources. The budget, in terms of our legislative work, is the heart of the matter. It's where it all begins. And this is a heartless budget. It's a heartless budget in some of the ways that the distinguished leader spelled out, and I think it does bear repetition to say what he is doing. Slashing $500 billion from Medicare. After he stood in front of the House and said, I'm protecting Medicare and Social Security, $500 billion out of Medicare. And from Medicaid, $900 billion. So if you're sitting at home at your kitchen table and you're a senior, or if there's a senior in your family on Medicare, you're getting cut. And if there is long-term care in your family's budget, you are getting cut. Two-thirds of long-term care is paid for by Medicaid. This is a middle-class benefit. Those cuts endanger the health of seniors and long-term care needs and for them and their families. And these Medicaid cuts also hurt rural hospitals, people seeking opioid addiction treatment, veterans and their families. More than 1 million veterans are on Medicaid. $900 billion cut from Medicaid. At the same time, the president is in court fighting to overturn the Affordable Care Act, which has, as you mentioned, the pre-existing condition benefit, so important to all of those families. But in this budget, what could possibly be his motivation to cut all that money from the CDC that you mentioned at the time of the coronavirus and the threat that that is, cutting money from CDC, the Center for Disease Control, using the full title, the prevention element of the good health of the American people. What could he be thinking? Maybe I'm using that term loosely. The president said he would fight for farmers. We all want to fight for farmers. But at a time when farmers are declaring bankruptcy at record rates, the president in this budget wants to slash the safety net by nearly $60 billion and ransack the U.S. Department of Agriculture. His budget also takes food off the table of hungry families of both rural and urban communities by cutting more than $180 billion from the SNAP program. SNAP program, some farmers, when I visit farmers in the Midwest, they say, we are farmers and we are on food stamps. It's such a sad thing. Their economies depend. That's when Senator Dole and Senator McGovern even began all of this, was to help people have food security, but also to help farmers have their economic security as well. Countless groups representing seniors, working families, and more have denounced the budget, from the Alliance for Retired Americans to the Young Invincibles. The young lobbyists, you've probably seen them. We've had 10,000 events to fight the repeal of the Affordable Care Act, at which the young, they weren't at all of them, but they were significant at those meetings. The young little lobbyists, some of them born with a pre-existing condition, many of them on Medicaid, they write, we are disappointed, though sadly not surprised, that the president has once again broken his campaign promise. We absolutely reject this vision for our country, and we call upon our legislators to reject this budget and the dangerous values it espouses. Our children's lives depend on it. And the National Committee to Preserve Social Security and Medicare writes, this budget will leave seniors and other vulnerable citizens hungrier, sicker, and poorer. It reveals the president's cruel priorities heading into the 2020 election. Chairman mentioned earlier that there are benefits to the high end in our economic life in our country. The president, in what he has been doing, what he talked about in the State of the Union, and what this budget is about, increases the national debt, passes that expense on to our children so that he can give tax cuts to the top 1% in our country. It's absolutely shameful. Again, the budget's supposed to be a statement of our values. Once again, this president is demonstrating how little he values the good health, financial security, and well-being of hardworking American families. This budget is an insult to the hopes and dreams and aspirations of America's working families. It increases the national debt. It must be rejected. And by the way, it is a complete abandonment of the budget agreement that we had with the domestic and defense priorities. Clearly, this administration cannot be trusted.